Where am I from? I's from Brooklyn. Do you want to make something of that?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Thoughts. I'm Katie.
And I'm Hamish.
Today on the show we've got Professor Jerrold Levinson from the University of Maryland. We'll be talking about his intentional historical definition of art.
Here are some thoughts on defining art.
So what are we talking about today then?
Well, we're talking about the philosophical approach to the question of what is art. And since I take it, if I understood correctly, that people listening to this podcast, why don't people have anything better to do? Listening to this podcast many of them haven't done any aesthetics, and also some of them haven't done any philosophy. So I'm going to try and focus on things that are, central and basic and not get into too much complexity. So why is there an issue about what art is and what can philosophers do in relation to that issue? Well, basically it's the crisis of art in the 20th century that generated this as a significant philosophical problem, that there were conceptions of art that seemed to work well enough in earlier centuries that started not working very well basically the beginning of the 20th century. So what are some of these older conceptions? If you start with Plato and Aristotle, what was their conception of art? And again, this is very rough. This is not in a scholarly way accurate. But it's the idea of imitation, or that the art is making images or pictures or representations of things, and they may be good or bad, but they should try to be realistic and maybe try to be morally beneficial. But so art is basically representational, imitational. That obviously doesn't have any use if you're talking about abstract art, let's say visual abstract art of the 20th century, which is in full bloom, beginning with Kandinsky and Mondrian, and a guy I'm very fond of that not many people know about named Kupka, a Czech artist. And then if you just think of music, and it isn't music with words or a story connected with it, that's also sort of abstract art. So it's just not clear that it's imitating or representing anything. So that idea doesn't seem to work. Another common idea is that artists are concerned with making beautiful things. Well, for a long time, this seemed to be true, and many of them succeeded in making beautiful things. But after all, there are a lot of beautiful things that aren't artworks. So it isn't as if art has an exclusive connection to beautiful things. But more seriously, more importantly, a lot of art at some point seemed to be aimed at something other than being beautiful, and sometimes being pointedly non-beautiful in order to express some particular idea or to express some sort of emotion or state of mind that is nothing like the state of mind you get when you behold something beautiful that you perceive as beautiful. So that doesn't seem to have much in the way of purchase on art in the last couple of centuries. If you're after a comprehensive view of what art is that you can, as comprehensive and broad and inclusive as you can make it, and that is one of the motivations behind the view that I defend, and of course behind the views that it's related to, that it historically actually comes from, namely the institutional view and the art world view, or rather in the reverse order. What about expression or emotion? A lot of art has to do with emotion and with the expression of emotion, but some art doesn't seem to be concerned with that. It seems to be more intellectual, more cold in some way, or more abstract. So what does that leave? Traditional ideas. Well, sometimes art is connected to the idea of skill, especially physically manifested skill of an extraordinary degree. It's the sort of thing that makes people, their jaws drop when they look at paintings by Rembrandt or Vermeer. Well, this is true that much art is a manifest display of exceptional skill in making things, but a lot of art is not. A lot of art, particularly minimalist art and conceptual art, seems to be flaunting the abandonment of anything like making objects to begin with, or particularly making objects that show significant skill. And this gives rise to a whole series of sort of jokes along the order of, well, I could have done that. Anyone could have done that, which applies in some sense to some minimal art and some conceptual art. Actually, I'm reminded here of a cartoon I once saw. I think I saved it somewhere. One of these cartoon strips with 4 or 5 boxes. So you see 2 guys in a gallery, and they're looking at some sort of minimal or conceptual art. And so in the first gallery, the guy who's familiar with the thing remains mum, and the other guy says, well, no, my brother could have done that. The second room, he says, my 3-year-old could have done that. In the third room, he says, my cousin Joe could have done that. Maybe even throws in his dog. My dog could have done that. Well, let's leave the dog out of it. So in the last frame, the guy who's been silent says, gee, I guess your family must be very talented. Okay, so the philosophical point there, if it wasn't obvious, is what is it to do that? You know, you have to specify that in a full, contextually sensitive way, and then you see that what rather simplified forms or gestures are doing is different than what you could do by doing something that looks like. And yes, you could become an artist and you could use simple forms, but what they did is not what you can do just by imitating the look or the pure perceptual properties of what you're making fun of.
It kind of seems like it's like a lot of modern art seems to be really what's causing problems with these theories. Has anyone just like bit the bullet and been like, you're just not making art? Like the Duchamp.
No, some theories, of course, they're obviously the conservatives, the artistically conservative, have simply denied that some of the signature things of 20th century art are art. So there's still people who don't accept that Duchamp's Fontaine, the upside down urinal, is an artwork, or that his snow shovel leaned up against the wall, which is called In Advance of a Broken Arm, is an artwork. Now the response might be, well, look, it has a title. Okay, I think titles are very important. I once wrote a paper about how important they are. But having a title is a sign that something's an artwork. It's because it doesn't maybe make it an artwork, and it isn't an essential feature of it. But yeah, there are a lot of people who don't accept that some of these iconic things that change the direction of 20th century art, particularly visual art, are artworks. And of course, there's always Cage in the musical sphere, the Cage examples, 3 minutes and 22 seconds. How can that be music? And therefore, how can it be art if there's no sound? Of course, there is sound. There's a sound that happens ambiently and accidentally in whatever place that performance is happening. So yeah, a lot of people do bite the bullet in that way, but that just seems just sort of retrograde and you know,
it's a bit of a cop out, I suppose.
yeah, well, yeah, it's like sticking your head in the sand in a way. So what else is left of the traditional views? Well, sometimes people like Beardsley, who used to be called the Dean of American Aesthetics. He had an aesthetic view of art. They say that something's an artwork if it's intended for aesthetic perception or aesthetic experience. That's not a bad view, but it's just not clear that that's what most of 20th century art, especially visual art, seems focused on, unless you have a very thin, a very too inclusive view of what aesthetic experience or aesthetic perception involves. Conceptual art also is particularly challenged for that view, since conceptual art seems to be cognitively, conceptually oriented and not oriented towards perception of aesthetic qualities, which qualities these sort of works often don't have, or don't have in any obvious way. So much for traditional views. So that's why the world was ready for Arthur Danto, who offered the art world view of what art is. Let's say that art is something that, well, here he's never made a canonical version of this, so people have to interpret what he meant exactly. That it's the art. Let's start with minimal claims. It's the art world somehow that makes something an artwork. How does it make it that? Well, let's leave that aside for a minute. Or he sometimes talked about artistic theory. I think there's a sentence like that, that it's the atmosphere of artistic theory around an object that makes it an artwork. Well, then you have to think, well, what is this atmosphere of artistic theory? Where did it come from? Does it come from the atmosphere? Or does it come from the artist? Does it come from the artwork? Does it emanate from the art? Or is it from like critics or curators? You know, all those questions are not clear in Danto's suggestion. But what is important in his suggestion is that was the first of the contemporary meaning, 1950 or later, theories of art that didn't try to locate arthood in anything intrinsic or functional, but in a sort of relation to something else, to a background theory or background sphere of thinking that could be called an art world or something like that. And the two successors, the institutional theory and the theory I tout, the theory I tout, are also relational theories. They abandon the attempt to think that art consists in something intrinsic, inherent, that you can like just see in the form or the structure or the appearance of it. But it consists rather in its being related in the right way to something else in the background. And Dickey did have the virtue of making a lot of these things very clear-cut and understandable in ways that are very vague in Dante. So he offered the idea that it was an institution. There was something called the art world institution. And Dante never liked that idea, so he didn't really accept the way Dickey developed his view. But at least it's clear that there's an institution, or sometimes I think the language of even social practice came into Dickey's discussions. There's this thing called the art world, which is an institution or social practice, and that people do things on behalf of it or in terms of this art world, and that's what makes the thing an artwork, because you're invited to see it as part of the art world. I've forgotten. Let's say you quoted one of Dickey's definitions here. What is it? Has conferred on it the status of candidate for appreciation by a member of the art world. Okay, now it's time for me to take my wallet open and find next to my Social Security and Medicare card my official art world identification card. Okay, so people have made some question about that. Some are humorous, some are serious. Who is a member of this art world, and how much of an official certificate do you need? But anyway, so that was a clear-cut definition, and then it was modified and made, I think, somewhat more interesting and streamlined in Dickey's later book, the one that I very harshly criticized. What is that book called? I've forgotten now. So yeah, so one of your questions is, so what's wrong with the institutional view? Well, do we really want to think that arthood is something that requires an institution in order to be the case, not just to be recognized, but that outside of institutional structures, even something loose like a practice, there couldn't be artwork. So in a couple of places, I just suggest that there could be art outside of institutions, and some of the thought experiments that I offer are some examples of this, of people, naive art makers who don't have any conception of an art world or of an institution, who do certain things that we would recognize as art making, or at least very, very much like art making, and easily assimilable to the idea that they're making art, even though there's either in that society, if we talk about primitive societies, maybe there isn't any such institution, or even in our modern world, they're just cut off from that institution. Whatever the art world is, there are certainly people around who have no notion of it and don't belong to it, whether or not they have that certificate. And yet it looks like they could be making art. So I don't have the convincing, I guess, claim for why you shouldn't think of art as an institution, but it just doesn't seem to fit with how I think we would like to think about art. It's something that really is a little more democratically available to any kind of creature who thinks and feels in any kind of way outside of the institutional structures.
I remember as well reading, I don't know if this applies to his later version, but the earlier version, Wilhelm's dilemma was quite a big problem for him, was it not?
Yeah. In one of my essays, I've forgotten which one now, even though I just reread them. Oh God, that was painful. I do try to take on the 4 criticisms in Wilhelm's critique, and as they apply to my view. But so he didn't attack my view directly, but clearly you could make similar attacks, and I tried to respond to them. But I've forgotten which essay that is in. I think it's in Refining Art Historically. Okay, so I haven't written a book to defend this theory, but it is laid out in 4 different essays. So one is called Defining Art Historically. That was followed, I think, after 10 years by Refining Art Historically, and then by another 5 years by Extending Art Historically. And then one I think you have on the Google Sheet, which I like, which is the last time I thought seriously about the view and the problems, how to deal with them, called the fancy title, The Irreducible Historicality of the Concept of Art.
So what is this theory?
Yeah, what is this theory? So yes, in relation to what I just recalled, the art world theory of Danto and the institutional theory of Dickey and some others, he's not the only one who pushes that. Stephen Davies has been sympathetic to it, and some other people, name I can't remember at the moment, also proposed institutional theories. What the theory I defend, the intentional historical theory of arthood, has in common with them is that it's a relational theory. It says that there's nothing inherent in the object that makes it art, but it's the relation of the object to some background in some way. But what I suggest is the background and the relation is different than what the art world theory and what the institutional theory maintain. What I propose is that the thing to which the would-be or candidate object has to be related is the history of art. And I don't mean like the history, like in the history book of it, but the total collection of things in the past that were artworks or counted as artworks. And this is important to add, and the art regards, so I'll get back to that are accrued in the course of that history, that in relation to which these things are seen or count as artworks. So the thing in the background that the object has to be related to is not the art world, it's not an institution, but is the history of art, understood concretely. And it's the history of our culture, our Western, or maybe even something to broaden it, human culture. So that's the thing it's related to is different. And also the relation is different. What's the relation? The relation is something about how the object is put forward, how it's projected, how it's intended to be dealt with. And I use a word that is obviously in its normal meaning a little too narrow, but I had to use one word, so I use this word regard. So it's how the thing is projected for regard. But it's important to see that regard, even though it's a somewhat visual word, I don't just mean looking at, that's one kind of regard, but I mean how a thing is intended to be taken or dealt with or interpreted or interacted with, or I don't know, I have any other synonyms hanging around. That's all that's supposed to be included in treated, yeah, treated, as if it was a patient needed to be cured. No, treated, you can treat things that aren't ill. You can treat your friends. That's even a nice kind of treat. So regard is should be understood as that whole range of things, ways we do with the object. So the thing in the background to which the object has to be related is different than in those predecessor theories, and the relation is different. It's being intended for regard in some way that some artwork in the past has been regarded, some artwork or artworks or genre of artworks or something like that from the history of art that has accrued up to this point. So that's what the theory is. And I think you have on the sheet a nice statement from probably that last article. Something's a work of art if and only if it is or was intended or projected for overall regard as some prior art is or was correctly regarded.
Would you mind explaining slightly more? I never fully understand what exactly you mean by like regards or regards. I know you kind of explained it, but could you just explain like a little bit more?
Well, when you're confronted with something, with an object, I use object very broadly as well. An older aesthetician, a Swedish kind of Göran Hamish, he said, well, how does this view deal with, conceptual art? Well, there's no problem with it dealing with conceptual because I talk about objects, because I mean object in the broadest possible sense, just like I mean regard in a very broad sense. Object is anything you can point to or name or think about that has some kind of identity. It doesn't have to be a physical thing. Okay, so what is it to regard an object? Well, it's to interact with it, look at it, see it, perceive it, deal with it, interpret it, respond to it, take it, construe it, and it's all those things.
Sorry, and then in like a complete way, I'm assuming it doesn't have to be like the same as some like previous artwork was regarded.
Yeah,
it's got to be like very similar. Or
well, okay, that's a point you could clearly pressure could be applied there. But the first thing is, of course, to avoid silly objections like some of the ones that Noel Carroll has made to the theory. It's particular, a single way of regarding it is enough to make something an artwork if you refer back to that. So the example is what should be regarded with attention to its color? Well, traffic signals should be, because otherwise you'll get crushed on the road. But of course, that's not enough. To intend something for regard in terms of the colors it presents is not enough to make something an artwork. And to sort of refer back to that is not enough to make something you now present an artwork. But it has to be some relatively complete way of regarding it. So it's true that, paintings are things that are to be regarded for their colors and the combination of colors they present, that's for sure. But it's also lots of other things that go into what it is to regard something as a painting, in terms of the sensitivity to what it might be expressing, or the convincingness of the representation, if it's representational, and the use of the medium, and the use or ignoring of the constraint that a rectangular frame provides, all sorts of things of that sort. So if you now intend some object, doesn't look like a painting, like, I don't know what it is, and I guess it would have to be sort of physical, at least perceivable, for that kind of regard, that whole set of regards that are part of what it is to regard something as a painting, then it seems to me pretty clearly that's going to be an artwork. So what's the theory is committed to is that intending something for one of these fairly complete ways of regard that earlier artworks have been accorded correctly or appropriately, that would be enough to make something an artwork.
And this
Not intending it for just one simple regard, like to be looked at. That would be another thing. That's even more minimal than that. To be looked at for its color combination.
This word intend is also quite important, I suppose, because I mean, on the face of it, almost it feels like you are almost maybe excluding something like the sort of naive art that you talked about being excluded from the art world view.
Okay, tell me if I got the question wrong, where you were heading towards. It's very important, and it's laid out in the first two articles clearly, is that there are two modes, basically two modes of art making. One mode of art making is art conscious or art aware art making. But there's another mode of art making, which is art unaware, art unconscious, non-conscious. You don't make it when you're asleep. You're not consciously thinking of art at all because you maybe have no conception of the pre-existence of the prior examples of art or the art history. But you're intending your object for a certain way of taking, a sort of relatively complete way of taking it or looking at it or viewing it, that in fact is in the repertoire of art regards, even though you don't know that. You don't know that that is part of the, not only the stockpile of things that have been artworks in the past, but more specifically, it's the stockpile of art regards that have been accumulated that are what's a good word, normative for a lot of those past artworks. And if you intend your object for that kind of regard, even though you know nothing about art, the history of art or art galleries or museum or anything, then that could be making art. But it's important to see that there are those two modes, the art aware and the art unaware mode.
Yeah, would that kind of just be how you'd respond to the Martian objection?
Okay, no, the Martian objection is more serious.
Okay.
Now we know, of course, there was never any civilization on Mars, but there might have been. So Mars could be any other planet somewhere in some other solar system. Okay, so how can they possibly be making art?
So if I understand it correctly, you think that maybe other cultures, maybe Martians, could have been creating art, stuff that looks like our kind of art, but clearly it's not connected in the right way to the history of Western art, our arts, that it needs to be in order to make it art. So we have a problem.
Yeah, okay, I got it. That was helpful. So what you need is just a liberalization of the idea of a connection to our art culture. And by our art culture, I mean the stockpile of things that have accrued as artworks and the stockpile of regards that are appropriately taken to those artworks, to treat them properly and to get the best out of them. So suppose there are on Mars, they're doing things like it seems we want to count as art, and yet they don't seem to have any connection to our art history or to an explicit awareness of the art regards that were part of that art history that accrued as ways that are proper to look at to interact with those objects. Okay, the idea is that our concept of art is such that it developed in our culture and it arose in our culture. And when we talk about the history of art, we are talking about the actual concrete Western or even human art culture. But that doesn't mean that our concept can't apply to things that are in another culture or on another planet. So why is it that we do think that those things are art that they're doing? It's because what they're doing is presenting objects for the kind of appreciation that we recognize that we know are part of our history of art regards. So there is a connection there. It's just it doesn't fit the initial definition taken without any charity, but it is there is got to be connection with our art history, in particular the stockpile of art regards that have accrued. That it's because they are doing that kind of activity. They have some kind of practice of presenting objects for that kind of treatment that we think, oh yeah, okay, that's making art. And it doesn't mean that they have any knowledge of our art culture, and especially in Curry's most difficult versions of this criticism. It could be that they could be, many millions of years after us or before us or in any place in time-space continuum. If we recognize that what was being done on those places, assuming there are any such, or at least hypothetically what might have been done in those places, is art, it's because we're connecting it to the stockpile of art regards in our concrete art history, saying that they are presenting objects for that kind of attention. So yeah, that's why we call them art. So our concept of art is anchored in our art history and the rule of objects and art regards in our culture, but the concept is applicable elsewhere, of course, in the way I suggested. But it doesn't mean that I'm saying that they are, when they present objects, they are aware of our art culture, or aware of the history of art on Earth. So that's the kind of response I would make to that objection.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
But
And
it was a good kind of objection, and it means that the basic definition in the first article, way back in '79, I guess it isn't quite true of those objects that they fit that definition. But I've explained how there's still got to be a connection with the concrete actual history of art on Earth.
And yeah, okay, fantastic. And the other interesting point, people might have problems initially with where the chain ends, where the buck stops. So do you want to talk a little bit about the first art?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. But here again, I've tried different gambits. I don't even remember them all exactly, and occasionally I take back some of them. Like one thing I think I said in one of the articles that I've taken back is that something could acquire art status retroactively. I think that's probably not true. That's not a good move. That's much too postmodern for me, actually. So I shouldn't have said that. What happens is that, of course, sometimes objects that are not art can be treated as if they were art. So this is true of a lot of objects that curators put in art museums, because they like those objects and they have aesthetic properties, and they're not curators of ethnographic museums. So they say, oh yeah, I'll put it in my museum. Oh, it's an art museum. That's a little dishonest, but of course there's a lot of that going on. But the fact that something has aesthetic properties maybe better than the average work of art doesn't mean it is automatically an artwork. There are some objects like that. There are objects that are made for purely ritual purposes, or for achieving some kind of solidarity of the group, or getting people worked up so they can be more effective warriors. There are some objects like that. That's what they were about, and really that's all they were about, pretty much. And yet they do have, incidentally, because they're made by talented people, aesthetically interesting properties, but that's not enough to make them artworks. But curators sometimes present those objects as if they were artworks, or they just claim they are artworks, whereas all they're really entitled to say is that if we took them to be artworks, we would be as artistically successful as a lot of artworks, which are literally artworks. So yeah, why don't you treat it as an artwork? But they're not that refined. I mean, they just say this is an artwork. But I think in some cases they're just wrong. That's an artwork. But there was no harm in seeing something as if it were an artwork and deriving what aesthetic pleasure you can get out of that. But they're not quite as honest as that in some cases. So that's different than whether any of the post-Duchampian appropriationist art objects can be art. Obviously, they can't. Anything can be art. That's the problem. What makes defining art so difficult? That any actual material or object, or physical or not, can become the core of an artwork. So let me get back to where we were in
this first art issue.
Oh yeah, the first. See, but that's yeah. So I've tried different gamuts. I'm not sure which is the best, but in one of the essays, I think I concede that clearly by the basic definition, if first art is art, it's not, it doesn't fit the basic definition, because it's not making a backward reference to something that was earlier art, because it's making backward reference to the arts, which are not art. Okay, so how can we solve this problem? Well, we could just declare or stipulate that arts are art.
And what do we mean by arts?
The things that preceded first art.
So for example, it could be these things you were describing before in the ethnographic museum.
Yeah, it could be. So some of those things could be art. And people have made something and say, well, look at the way you looked at that thing, but actually you look at it for its form and its quality as well, not just the practical purpose that it was made for. So that Okay, but so there are different things you can say, and so one concession would be to say, well, there are two slightly different ways to be in our work. One that covers 99.9% cases, namely that it's something you intend for sort of treatment that something earlier that was art, was acknowledged as art, had received correctly. And then there are these things called first art, which are art in some other way, for some other reason, not for that reason, because they don't have an earlier art to refer to. So why are we making this exception? Well, without considering first art to be art, then of course you can't get the whole chain going. So why is it first art? Well, it's because the theory needs to be first art. I mean, no, listen, a more serious answer is something like, it's sort of retroactive, but I think not viciously, that we see that there were these chains in history of backward reference, and that there's a place where these chains begin, and these chains are chains of artworks, because all the later things are recognized to be artworks. So there is this earliest part of the chain where there's a backward reference to something else, but that isn't art. And yet, let's just say that the beginning, that is art, because it is the beginning of this chain of backward referencing for art making, where what is backward referenced is a proto artwork, but isn't actually an artwork. I mean, the arts. So that's a little messiness you have to accept. But let me go to a point I made at the beginning of our discussion, that what things you say about art or for art don't really matter. What it really matters is what do we mean by making art now? And the fact that you have different ways of finessing, more or less convincing, the status of art and first art, and why first art is art and art isn't quite, but it's still an essential thing in the story. It doesn't affect the fact that now, when you say that something is art, there's nothing you could mean except what's given by the basic definition, because there's no constraint on intrinsically on what can be an artwork. So what makes it art? Well, it's that you want people to somehow connect it to pre-existing art. How? What somehow? Well, that's, you want it regarded in something like the way that some earlier art was regarded. Here's a point I make, which I haven't mentioned before in our discussion today. Sometimes, in the case of very avant-garde, very revolutionary art, the idea is to get beyond all the past ways of regarding art, but there has to be an initial gesture towards them. Otherwise, you can't get it to be taken up as art at all. But your intent may be that you'll see that no previous way of looking at artworks is adequate to this, or makes any sense for why I presented this sort of thing, whatever it is. But you have to start there. Otherwise, there's no sense in which you're making art. You have to connect to the tradition, even if your idea is to overthrow it or revolutionize it.
This has been a fantastic discussion. It's so interesting to hear the theory from the horse's mouth, and it is very convincing, it has to be said. Kate, do you want to even ask what grinds your gears?
Yeah, sure. No, the final question was just what in philosophy grinds your gears / PG.
What grinds my gears? That empirical philosophy is going to replace speculative or thought-centered philosophy. And especially this kind of attitude on the part of psychologists, as in regards to aesthetics, to think that all the questions of aesthetics will be answered by psychological experiments.
But I mean, you have to admit, it's quite an attractive idea that because science does seem to be constantly expanding. You're a chemist yourself, and explaining all of these things that we before couldn't. So why do you hate that idea so much?
No, I don't hate that. I just think that it shouldn't be taken too far. I mean, one thing I've written somewhere shows that clearly the psychological research can be relevant to philosophical aesthetics. The most obvious way to me is that in aesthetics, some of our issues are normative, not just descriptive. So you might recommend that people appreciate or perceive things in a certain way. But what if psychological research shows that people cannot perceive things in that way? I mean, I have in mind the things I've written about large-scale synoptic appreciation of works of music, symphonies that are an hour and a half long. Is this possible? And so, if psychological research shows that people can't really have that kind of grasp of a temporal object beyond a few minutes, then it's silly for us to have an aesthetic prescription that you should try to when you listen to a symphony, you should try to have a synoptic vision of the whole symphony while you're listening to it. That if it's psychologically impossible, it's obviously silly to make that an aesthetic prescription. So that's one obvious way in which psychological research can be relevant to at least the normative part of aesthetics. It's going to put limits on what we think is an appropriate critical or aesthetic attitude to take towards works. But there's lots of other ways in which just psychological research is relevant. It's just that psychological research doesn't answer all the analytical, conceptual, normal questions that aestheticians, philosophers of art are interested in, rightly so.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, and hopefully you'll come back on the podcast sometime
Well, I
soon.
hope I was somewhat coherent today.
Oh, you absolutely were. Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody so much for listening.
Remember to follow us on Facebook at ThoughtsUFG and on Twitter and Instagram at Thoughts_UFG.
We'll see everybody next week.